And okay, so now we can maybe can start with a presentation from the University College in London, where we have a pleasure to have Rory Green, who is the director of Interactive Architecture Lab there, and I think is going to give a very interesting talk because. Which is actually related to the last video that Rolf showed us, no? Because while actually the movie the cartoon was about some random movement of geometric figures, we tend to attribute intentions to that figure and to see a strange story of a figure hunting the other one. So we really want to give meaning to the matter. And this is an opportunity for architecture. And Rory will tell us what they are doing, the very interesting things they are doing in that area. So Rory, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you also, Nathan, for all your help with getting all of this to work. I know Nathan's actually going to be switching slides for me on his end because I have a lot of videos, so it's appreciated. So this is a short talk. I'm getting a bit of feedback, sorry. I'm hearing myself in one of your rooms. I'm not sure which one.
We can hear you. No, it's okay.
You got? Yeah, okay. No, I mean, I can hear myself. Now I can't. That's better, actually. That's great. Thank you. So, where shall I start? Well, I was. It was really, it's great to be following up Rolf's talk because, I think he's given quite a kind of range of theoretical concepts for me to respond to. So I'm not going to try to add really any more to that theoretical discussion, but rather share with you maybe a bunch of projects that we do in the lab, and maybe generate some ideas or some conversations. And I want to just maybe also to an audience that working primarily within robotics research, just to show you how other disciplines like architecture and design are taking an interest in it now, and are doing their best really to get up to speed on a lot of technical and also theoretical conversations and approaches that have been going on for a long time in robotics. And so I have for quite some time had to sort of teach myself robotics and then teach others. I've had to explore disciplines that are not typically part of an architect's training. Well, one of the things that's become really fascinating in the last decade or so has been an explosion in the use of robotic technology within architecture schools and now increasingly into the industry. This is primarily through the use of industrial robot arms, but I'm not going to talk about any of that today. It's a potentially huge industry. It's a potentially very interesting conversation that we could have, but it would be a very different one to the one that I'd like to have, and one that follows up from what Rolf has been talking about. But just to say that my lab is also very much involved in working with robotic fabrication, and it crosses over into the worlds that I will talk about today, which is more to do with interaction, primarily when we look at ideas around real feedback, real-time sensing and response. And these are questions that come up in fabrication when you start to take fabrication out of, say, highly structured environments like factories, and you start to imagine robots on building sites, robots in close proximity to human laborers and so on. So interaction actually does go over into the world of robotic fabrication, but the work I'm going to show you today is much more in the world of experiential design, in the world of art, And the work primarily is robotic environments and robotic instance of movement, but also the use of light and sensing and sound. And I've been fascinated for some time about how, as an architect, I can make my environments responsive to people and sensitive to people, and adapt to how people occupy spaces, and also adapt potentially to how other creatures might occupy our architecture, or indeed how our environment around us is changing hour by hour. And increasingly also interested in how new types of kind of artificial agency start to change the way the built environment might be designed. So driverless cars, for example, will change the way that we design urban infrastructure. We won't need to have parking spaces outside of the front doors of people's houses, for example. Simple idea, but could radically change the way that we design buildings and cities. So within all of that, the bit that I want to talk to you about today is to do with, I'll call it kind of sloppy design. And it's the idea that we don't do very good robotics at my lab. In a kind of classical sense, we make very sloppy robots. They wobble, they shake, they don't have any precision really. They're not very intelligent. And I'm sure many of the students in the rooms here around the world will have built more sophisticated code for your machines than perhaps I have done. But I'm able to use relatively simple bits of code, relatively amateurish kinds of robotics, to build things that are engaging for people and draw their attention and get them talking. Hopefully get them to have an experience that is memorable, if not unforgettable. And so I'm going to show you a few little projects that sort of bring you into that world. Long before there were roboticists, and the architects were very much the machine makers. So the deep history of architecture is of the architect as the master craftsman. And the very first publications in architecture, well, the very first or the oldest surviving publication in architecture, which is Vitruvius's Treatise, has an entire book within it dedicated to machines, sort of water organs, various kind of mobile war machines, and an automaton. And so the kind of deep history of architecture and machine making is closely linked, although certainly we're not considered machine makers in the broader sense today. But my practice is very much looking at the use of building and making machines, and this film should start playing in a second. This gives you a little bit of an idea about the way that I might be working. This is a project I did with a group of a collaboration with a couple of artists to build a artwork that is partly a sculpture, partly a custom robot that uses light as the kind of principal animator of a space. But in my practice, I'm the machine maker. So I'm at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. We have the facilities to go about and build custom robots. But in these situations, this is a very, very delicate needle-like robotic arm designed to very carefully hold this bright light within a copper ring structure that we've built. The copper ring structure is surrounded by text, which is laser cut out of it. The text was crowdsourced by asking people to describe their dreams, and then this light travels around inside the structure, projecting through the text onto the surface of the surrounding building. The building was an abandoned church in central London. And people can walk up underneath, put their hands up, and actually move that light around and project that text into the space. So it's a little bit like a kind of a seance, I like to describe it. Other kinds of work that I might be doing is building structures. This is or rigging structures. This is a aluminium truss rig that we hung 42 robotic winches on, and then dropped these 42 RGB colored balls, which rose and fall inside of the atrium of a engineering headquarters in London. These are the kinds of projects I often do for public artworks, but these aren't so much of what I'm going to talk about today, but it just gives you a bit of a background to some of the work that I'm doing as a machine maker. The project I want to talk to you about is actually, and the project that's kind of generated my interest in animation comes from a project I did actually as a student 10 years ago now, called Performative Ecologies. Now, I was in an architecture school studying architecture, so it was a little bit radical at the time for me to be building robots. But the reason I was because I was interested in the question of what was, as a designer, would I design the behavior of objects if they were able to move, or would I design the objects to evolve their own behaviors? So would I be able to enter into a kind of a conversation with an environment about its behavior? And this was a larger question about how we interact with architecture. How does one design the behavior of a smart architecture, or does one try and give it the ability to evolve and develop its own behaviors so that it can perhaps change over time in response to changing conditions? So this machine wakes up. This is it waking up at the beginning of the performance, and these four very dumb objects turn around inside of the gallery looking for people to perform to. Now, I haven't programmed them with any movements, but I've given them these tails of light that can change color, and they can produce patterns, and they start to flick these tails, and they start to look at people's degrees of attention to assess how successful they are at keeping people's attention. And this work was somewhat, well, there's a number of examples of people doing this in digital objects, people like Carl Sims. There's also work by, I was inspired by people like Hod Lipson and his resilient machines that kind of develop their own behavior based on their morphology rather than actually being pre-programmed with them. So these machines have an instinct. I describe it as a goal to attract attention. They have no idea how to do that, but they just perform. And in the act of performing and observing how successful they are, they learn, and then their behavior emerges out of that. And here, two machines performing to each other start to share what they've learned with each other. So one of them will be like, okay, so I think that red is particularly attractive, and the other one says, no, it's all about flashing, and starts flashing and performing back to them. So this is a kind of a dance that people can watch, and then once the dance is finished, they turn around to people and start to perform again. So the reason I begin with this is only to show you a project that I produced that's not specifically dealing with animism or trying to create life, but when I presented this to a number of galleries around the world, I was amazed by the response, because I was fascinated primarily with the question about intelligence and how you would design machines that have developed their own kind of opinions about how they should behave, rather than the designer designing the behavior in advance. And these are questions that I think have been around for some time in different ways, particularly in robotics and so on, but these are quite opposite to the way that people were thinking about how buildings would be designed and how we would design even the kinds of technologies that we use, like smartphones and so on, that at the time were very much had a master-slave paradigm to them. And increasingly we're looking for much more kinds of conversational types of interaction paradigms to work with. But one of the big lessons that I came away from this particular project was when I exhibited it in Sao Paulo, and here you can see the four of them arranged in a line. And they've been arranged in all sorts of different configurations, which also tends to change the way that their behavior emerges. But the thing that became fascinating for me is that over the 3.5 months that these were exhibited, 250,000 people interacted with these objects. And I was thrilled. I was excited to come back and see the machines at the end of the 3 months exhibition, just to see how much they changed. And for me, that was one insight. But the thing that was most interesting for me was how the people who worked inside of that gallery every day, looking after these installations and talking to the public, had actually named each of the robots a different name. very much based around the characters that had merged out of the machines. And so they'd taken a kind of they'd built an emotional connection with the machines, which was much deeper than I had ever expected. So I became fascinated by this question about what it was, you know, somewhat disappointed that people weren't interested in talking to me about questions about artificial intelligence, but also very excited about the fact that people had projected so much personality and had built an emotional relationship with them. And so kind of going to try and understand better why this happened, I turned to, first of all, I turned to puppetry to start to, and spoke to a man here called Ronnie LeDrew, who's one of the UK's leading puppeteers. He was one of the puppeteers of many of my childhood favorite puppets, which was an extraordinary thing to be talking to and to be meeting the hand that was inside of Zippy, one of my favorite childhood characters. But the insights that I really got from working with Ronnie came about when I started to build machines and show him the machines I was building, and he would bring one of his he'd bring some of his marionettes along and start to perform with the marionettes. And so we would be having these strange conversations where I'd be showing him a machine and talking about how it would move, and he would be showing me one of his various his marionettes and how they move. Following up one of Rolf's kind of one of the things that Rolf was talking about, what was so fascinating for me about the way that Ronnie would work with his puppets was that the puppets, naturally, because of the materials they were made out of, the balance of the materials, whether it was a cloth or whether it was wood, depending on the types of joints that were used, the marionettes themselves would have certain personalities, and those personalities would be inherent to the material design of the puppet. Before Ronnie had even picked it up, there was a personality within inside of that marionette. And so in a way, he would get to know the marionette and get to understand how he can bring it to life. It wasn't that he was in complete control. He couldn't give it any personality that he would wish. And that was fascinating in itself as an insight. We had a very long conversation. So this video we've seen, which means I can skip over it, but just to remind you of the beginning of it. Another field that I was looking at was in the world of visual emotional perception, and how scientists had been also looking at certain similar questions in a way. And so these sorts of animations became very, very fundamentally important to me as an architect, because here simple geometric objects could have personality and life. I didn't have to build things that looked like they were alive simply by the quality of the movement, and particularly the relationships between different movements. Very complex narratives and very meaningful forms of expression could emerge. I'll skip forward though, but to the triangle itself. The triangle became a kind of motif then for the last few years of work that I've been doing. And a couple of pieces of work that I'm going to skip across fairly quickly, because I also want to show you some of the students' work that sort of, I think, expands a little bit beyond just this particular motif of the triangle. But here's the installation at Tate Modern, at the Pompidou in Paris. This is us installing it inside of the Picasso gallery. So you can see in the background the Devant sur la Mer by Picasso, and this is a piece that was designed to reflect, in a way, that particular artwork. It's a size-specific piece of work designed to kind of animate the space and to ask questions about the work around it. And I'll skip forward, but just to say that you'll see from that there's lots of wobbling and lots of unexpected kind of consequences from our engineering there. But that all became part of that personality, and we kind of embraced it rather than being actually worried about it. And the actual behavior of that was much, much simpler than the AI that I'd been trying to build earlier. And I brought the same coding into the next piece, which I'm going to show you, so I'll explain the kind of sensing and response in the context of the next piece of work, which was at the Tate Modern in London, which is London's kind of leading modern art gallery. The space that I showed my work was in the bottom chamber of this. This is before the new wing of the Tate was built. And just to give you a sense of scale, the bottom chamber there is called the tank, the south tank. And that tank was where the installation was built. So this is it. The next image shows you this cavernous space that the work was installed inside of, and it was called Fearful Symmetry. And it was called Fearful Symmetry, which is a line from a William Blake poem, which describes a person's experience of meeting a kind of a life force, a vision of something terrifying in the dark, and the questions that it generates inside of the observer or the visitor that about the nature of life. And so it seems so important. And it has this lovely phrase, fearful symmetry, which I chose to take then for the piece. What it meant in reality was that I was offering to bring a single light source, this floating glowing tetrahedron, into the gallery to become a kind of guide, a companion to bring people through the gallery space. So to do so, just to give you a bit of background, because I'm sure you'll be interested in this, I had to install a 21-meter motorized rail. I had to build what I believe to have been the largest Delta robot of the time. I don't know if anyone's built one since that was any bigger. It's about 5 meters tall. And all of this done on a very meager arts budget, I can assure you. But the principal materials around this were a carbon fiber body, but then this is the critical material really, which is a electroluminescent sheet. It's 0.3 millimeters thick. It produces the most beautiful flat white light. And this was able to give this glowing tetrahedron a kind of strange ghostly appearance. It's the type of light that's not used often in a kind of domestic or public environment. So because of that strange ghostly quality to it, it had a certain sort of presence to it. We had to build a structure, so various experiments with tetrahedron structures to then hold it. And here you can see it hung. And it's hung off the rail. I'll show you a picture of the full-size one in a second, but just to give you a bit of an example, this is a video of the quarter-size arms that we put on it, which was us just doing a few experiments getting it to do some simple rotational movements. You'll see that that's actually hung above on the rail system that the whole thing traveled upon. The full-sized arm here you'll see on the next image is us. This is with its arms lifted up almost. It's actually much taller when it's dropped down, but this was the limits of the space that we were working within. And you'll see the use of these fine carbon rods, which I thought of as a little bit like marionette strings. So this is a sort of huge marionette puppeteering hand that's puppeteering this small light beneath it. But the virtue of the Delta robot is that because there are no motors actually on the moving parts of its body, the body itself can be extremely lightweight, very mobile for the scale of it, but also safe. All important things when you're moving robots above public's head. So these are images, a series of images that capture the effect of that in that space. Before I show you a bit of video of it, when people would stand underneath it motionless, it would hover above them, again almost motionless, maybe slowly geometrically turning, encouraging them to perhaps start to move. If you start to move and come to life, it responds by mirroring those behaviors back to you, by actually playing almost directly, feeding off your movements with an equivalent response. And then there was a series of other movements that were designed around encouraging people to move through that space, which if too many people got close to it, it would run away. If there was just a single person there, it would hover above them. And if there was no one above it, it would kind of search out the nearest person and approach them, as long as there weren't too many people there. So these simple, very simple rules were enough in the context of a constantly shifting environment, constantly complex environment, was enough to be able to create an ongoing complex performance. So again, very much in response to the ideas of this from the science of the artificial and Herbert Simon's ideas about the ant walking on the beach. In our case, the complexity is actually the public visiting. The machine itself is relatively simple, but yet the behavior, the dynamic expression of the machine actually comes from the dynamic expression of the public beneath it. So this is just to show you a bit of feedback from the public.
It reminded me of being in one of those scary films. reminded me of one of those dreams you have, you know, when aliens sort of invade the Earth, and it seems something like that. The triangle of light came on and appeared to be following people.
It kind of creeped me out how it knew how people were standing and where to go.
You could see the reactions of all the other people. They weren't quite sure what was going on.
You expect something a bit scary, but then, I don't know, its movements are kind of organic, and I don't know, it seems very friendly.
Okay, so just to give you, now we'll show the film briefly, and then I would like to show you a few students' projects. And I'll just finish with, you can of course see all of this online as well if you're interested in seeing more of this. Just to finish on this image, this is one of my favorite images because it shows a parent lifting up their child who wants to reach out and touch light. And I feel like that in that instance there's a moment of an emotional connection. And importantly for me, an emotional connection that's positive. So the idea that you walk into this dark space that people will never have visited, I should have said this is the first time that the space had been used for an installation. It had been previously an unused space within the building. And so this was very much for people their first time in. So it was completely dark, and this light became perhaps at first a kind of terrifying vision, but would become suddenly your companion and bring you through. And as you would do that, you would build a rapport with it that would eventually lead to you in this case, wanting to reach out and touch it. So for me, this is a kind of success image of that project. The Interactive Architecture Lab is my research lab at UCL, and I want to show you a bit of this work just for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, because it really, just to give you an impression of how some of these ideas have branched out, and also into the way I teach, and increasingly the way I wish to practice in the future. It also, I think, perhaps responds to some of the things that Rolf's been talking about. And so it's not just about animacy now. We're just dealing with machines and how we might imagine new kinds of robotics inhabiting our built environment, and how I think the questions around the physical nature of objects that are intelligent and moving, the kind of physiology or the morphology of these things will be as important as, say, any of the kind of programming that we might feed them. So the first project is Furl, and it's really in lots of interest in soft robotics. I just want to give you a bit of a background on how I would start teaching. So this is a video of we would begin having to introduce basic mechanics to students. You've got to appreciate architecture students don't understand or have any training in mechanics. So you might build a little physical model. And at this point, you might start to think, well, how can I turn this into something perhaps quite beautiful or more spatial, something a bit like a canopy, a kinetic canopy. So you might learn a cam system. But these are very kind of Victorian types of mechanics. How can we then might bring a bit of lighting in to enhance or accentuate that movement? But then how might we start to look at much more interesting types of wing movement, like how do muscles work, right? How can we look to kind of biologically inspired forms of movement, perhaps as a more interesting way of getting things to move and transform? And how does how does material become a critical part of behavior? These are interesting and important questions for robotics, but also interesting and important questions for architecture. And as these two worlds combine, I think it's important that we can kind of introduce these conversations to architects. So these are various videos really of dancing robots and so on. I think there's probably enough soft robotics, soft robotics. But this is important in that we're also deeply interested in the quality of light. This is perhaps something that is less important to a lot of robotics, but the way that materials change their translucency as they expand and contract, I think, is a really interesting territory for us to contribute to. So just to show you a bit of the results of this project, this became a kind of, this is one unit out of what became a model of, for a pneumatic pavilion. And I'm going to skip across this and just show you some of the images, just because I think I want to focus on the later projects. But you'll see how, as architects, there's also an interest in how these things might scale up. And there are lots of interesting questions around soft robotics to do with actually scaling these kinds of materials. These are real challenges that my lab is currently looking at the moment. We'll skip that, yeah. Like I said, all of these films are on the Interactive Architecture Lab website. So this is right out of Furl's presentation, which is, I've always had a fascination with walking machines and things that can move. And so here, very similar process. We begin with a simulation of a walking. So we start to simulate these passive dynamic walkers. Then we try and build them. We realize that actually it's not so easy. That the minutiae of fabrication errors that we might have can influence the way that things will behave. And so we then start to kind of, so there's a whole series of sort of simulating and making and simulating and making and looking at the differences between the simulated model and the physical model. And this project sort of moved away from the walking approach towards the idea of structures that might change their length, the length of their struts, and by doing so shift their center of gravity, and that this shifting of center of gravity would allow them to propel themselves. And so here you can see just as these struts get to a certain length, suddenly it makes a step. So this is the first sort of prototypes that we then were to be able to move on to, but also to be able to imagine again the sort of architectural implications of these, the kind of playground structures that might be able to inhabit a park, for example. As an architecture school, we're interested in the details and trying to actually solve how you build these things. And I'll just show you the most recent iteration of this that we had this summer, which I don't think we've shown too many people yet. So this is... Okay, so yeah, this is you can think of this a little bit like a module, a single module, which might be part of a much larger array of these that might be able to start to combine, build larger structures. Our original ideas is what would it be like for it to be a playground, but we're obviously interested in the broader implications that we might have for structures that can shift their center of gravity and move around, and also potentially respond to all sorts of environmental or conditions or the behavior of inhabitants. Just to show you, we also bring our work out into the world, so we bring it to exhibitions because it's very important to see how the public are going to respond. So here's a very quick overview of a few projects from the lab, which are perhaps more in the world of kind of playing with magic, really. And this is kind of Victorian tricks. This is Eye Catcher, a frame that moves around the wall. It actually has a small pinhole camera built into it that looks at people's expressions and then actually tries to mirror them back with this strange black ferro fluid that floats within a clear gel. And we use this to essentially become a kind of very simple character, much like those triangles and circles earlier on, that just plays with people and mirrors their expressions back to them in an abstract way. Another machine from that exhibition was called Bump. It's a 3-axis spherical robot. This is the inside of it. And Bump really is this rather dumb spherical robot that just crashes its way around the gallery, responding to sound, and sort of wrestling with small children. But just the magic of having something like a ball come to life suddenly has this really strong emotional effect on us, and encourages people to play and have fun and talk and exchange. I've shown you morphs already, so I'll skip over morphs, which is the next piece. But just to give you a bit of an idea about some of the things we're hoping to do now is to wrap the morphs in electroluminescent sheet to turn it into a mobile lighting installation. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to show you is, as I need to wrap up, this is the Re-Earth project, which deals with plant behavior. And this is looking at how we can measure the actual behavior of, plants don't have a nervous system, but they can be electrophysiologically stimulated, and we can measure this, and so we can start to take readings about their response to their environment. So we can, for example, look at how light will change the readings we get off those plants. And so we did some simple experiments to get an understanding of the kinds of responses we would get. And then we looked at the idea of, could we build a sort of spherical robot that would become a garden that would be able to transport a garden around the city, or might be able to, could the plants or the readings from the plants start to drive a robot, essentially. So these are sort of some of the sketches from that. These are just concept sketches. The idea being that each of the many plants that would live on this garden would have a single vote. So each plant would say, I need sunlight, or I've had enough sunlight, or I need to get some shade, or whatever it might be. And if we can measure, we can get information about the state of those plants, that might be able to control the global behavior of this machine. In a way, it's a kind of embodied realization of sort of Buckminster Fuller-like ideas around spaceship Earth. And that kind of socially orientated idea of ecosystems democratically, kind of collaboratively operating. So this is just the video of the making of, and all of this is online. So Nathan, I wonder if you can skip towards the end of this video, the last sort of minute or so. Maybe you can skip to the last minute of it. Yeah, just to hear is fine. So there's 12 gardens, each individually able to push their gardens in and out. And by doing so, these gardens are able to shift the center of gravity of this sphere structure and allow it to step. The idea being that we will be able to have each of those gardens, we've given it this name, HortaSnack, sort of the idea of it being a sort of new type of machine garden, sort of hybrid. And so just really looking at the idea of bringing plants' behavior into a kind of cybernetic feedback loop with the machine, and the kind of potential opportunities that come out of that for looking at designing buildings that might measure the plant well-being, and actually that starts to drive the architecture. So it's a bit of a kind of speculative, playful project. Can I see the next image, which I think is the image of it on the road? The idea that potentially in a world full of autonomous driving cars, there's no reason why we might not have autonomous driving gardens, and they may have responsibilities like repopulating certain plant species in certain areas, being a kind of urban gardener. So some of these ideas are more speculative and playful, and our explorations of technologies and so on, and provocations also to designers to try and engage with robotics, to understand its power and its potential to design better buildings and better cities. I think that's probably it. I just want to say that I think that the work that goes on in robotics is really important to design, and the only way that I think we can probably try and build better architecture and maybe better robots is actually to spend more time collaborating and working on projects together. As you can see, we do our best to build robots, but we're not roboticists, and so we always are looking to work with other people. We're also really interested in having collaboration or exchanges with students and bringing students from robotics backgrounds into architecture school and vice versa. So I hope that's interesting, and I hope that raises some questions. I've got time for maybe one or two before I've got to run. You've got to excuse me. I've got to go to a site meeting about a building. But that's me for today. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the fascinating talk. I really think that something that was dreamed of in the 70s is now becoming a reality. And I'm also happy that completely randomly we have this dark Blade Runner-ish look here in Pontedera. And so I guess if someone has some question from a global lecture. Because if there are no questions, actually, a question?
Good morning. Yeah,
Good morning.
I have a question from Madrid.
Yeah.
Well, Roddy, thanks for your talk. It's amazing your work on the machines that you build. It's incredible. You've mentioned motion like the key point of bringing machines alive. Is there any other issues that we should include in a robot, talking about my field, when we want to bring them alive? What are the clues for bringing machines alive?
Okay.
Your experience?
Yeah, okay. So I would say that undeniably from all of my research, motion is primary. And so just talking about motion, I think we can learn a lot from the field of animation theory, the work of people like John Lasseter and Pixar. They've done a lot of really interesting work with kind of building the fundamental rules that you can use to sort of give different types of animacy to objects. So certainly animation have really condensed a lot of that theory. Puppetry is less well written about because it's a bit of a kind of fringe discipline. It doesn't have the same kind of conferences and the same sorts of kind of publishing power, and so it's a bit more but it has an interesting different slant on it, which is worth it looking deeper at. Outside of movement, sound of course is complementary, and synesthetic kind of the use of multiple senses will always be more powerful, and so bringing movement and sound together would undoubtedly be would be where I would go next after movement, long before I would ever choose to put eyes on anything or put hair on it or whatever else you might want to put on it. But certainly if I was going to start to add one single piece of physiology, or sorry, one recognizable kind of figurative property to a robot, it would be eyes, and then later perhaps and immediately we go back to puppetry again, and about the use of gaze to project people's thoughts into objects. So movement is primary, sound would be secondary, and that would be just the kind of fundamentals without going into any deeper. I'm happy to talk to you deeper about it later if you want to have another conversation about it.
Maybe I can ask a question from Zopa?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so I really like the stuff also about the gardens and about the sphere there. I think it's wonderful work. Now, we used to have a project on plant computing, and so one of the issues that we have there is, I think, it does make sense to talk about plant computing. There's not only neural computation, there's also plant computation. And you seem to be using the state of the plant as a driving force for, this movement of the sphere. Now, what about, I mean, one of the issues there is the time scale. Timescales are, of course, for plant computing and change of physiological state of plants are completely different from the neural system. It's much, much slower. So how can you actually get physical movement given the slowness of the processes that you actually find in the plant?
Okay. Although it's a very slow robot, that's a very fast building in my book, right? So buildings move a lot slower than that usually. And so 20 minutes or half an hour or an hour for a response is absolutely fine for me, in terms of thinking about the kinds of things that I'm trying to modify, right? So that would be the simplest one. It's not always as human-centered. It's not always. I'm not always just building dancing robots for people. Although I like doing that. I think timescales are relative to need, right? Response times are relative to need. So I'm very happy with the speed of the things like morphs and re-earth. In a way, they also provide time for people to get out of the way, and that's a big part of some of the other considerations I have to do with health and safety, like big robot playgrounds and small children are generally not two things you'd want to have in the same space. But if they're moving slowly enough, you might be able to pass the health and safety to actually be able to put these in environments with people. So slow moving robots actually are definitely an important strategy for thinking about kinetic architecture.
Okay, very interesting point. Yeah, very good point. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. If there are no questions, I may just do a comment about the fact that people is worried about robots stealing our jobs, right? And people is guessing what will people do when all our boring activities will be automated and performed by AI. Probably we will have to look to a new kind of products and design aesthetical, a new kind of design object which are interactive as you're building, no? Because you talk mainly about work of arts and buildings. But maybe this is actually a question. So there is also space for a new set of design products for, living furniture and animated furniture. What do you think about that?
So I think that, that all of those things are probably have some kind of niche attraction. There's a lot of things going on right now with robotics and design where a lot of people are putting bits of robots into archetypal design objects and getting lots of press for them, although the objects aren't particularly interesting, certainly in the way that they behave. They just sort of move or whatever it might be, and there's a certain amount of theatre and all of that, and I certainly get press for that sort of general excitement about animation of objects. But actually, I think the deeper, perhaps more interesting question is that there is a new aesthetic of animacy that's going to emerge in our built environment, and it's going to appear from the material scale to the building scale, and it's going to be occurring in in a range of products, some of which we will perceive, and in other things we won't perceive. But it'll be these kinds of tiny little bits of animacy that are sort of very much in the same way that one feels that they're surrounded by life when they might be walking through a forest or, you know, spending any time in nature. It's not that you're surrounded by things that have an equivalent kind of animacy to a human being, but actually that they have degrees of intelligence that rise along a kind of gradient. So I think that what we perhaps need to do as designers is to try and develop a sort of theoretical framework for understanding and designing animus behavior and trying to deepen the kind of ways of categorizing and crafting intelligent behavior into things. But I think part of it can be about puppeteering and about performance and playfulness and giving things sort of human-like character. But I think much more deeply we have to think about how we have to think about the emotional and psychological impact of these kinds of objects and how actually we may become much more attached to things. We may struggle to turn things off or to, you know, and the kinds of the way that this new animacy will affect our emotionals, our relationship with our surrounding environment. I think that's a really fascinating new territory, and I think we're going to end up with very strange things happening as a result. You know, you already hear about soldiers who are responsible for these robots that decommission mines, and you know, in Afghanistan or wherever they are. And if their robot gets blown up by a mine, they carry the robot into the robot hospital, you know, in tears, like they're carrying a comrade, and dropping them on a desk and saying, "Please, doctor, save his life." You know, that sort of intense relationship with things I find very peculiar and you know, worrying and also fascinating in equal respect. So as a designer, I think I'm trying to get my head around that and see how that changes the way we design objects, but also how we kind of think about objects, and how we relate to them.
Okay. Thank you very much. So really fascinating. Thank you for your talk, and also thank you for your work. We are indebted to you. So
thank you very much.
Thank you. And okay.